Picture this. August 15th, 1969. The sun is rising over a muddy field in upstate New York. 500,000 people are waiting. The festival is already running hours behind schedule. And on that stage stands a man with an acoustic guitar, about to become a legend. But here's what most people don't know. That guitar, the one that opened Woodstock, came from a company that almost nobody expected to survive. This is the story of Guild guitars. Most guitar players can rattle off the big names, Gibson, Fender, Martin. But Guild was different. Guild was the underdog, the scrappy New York outfit that built instruments so good, so uniquely voiced that some of the greatest musicians in history chose them over the giants. And it all started with a guy who sold used accordions. His name was Alfred Dronge. Born in Poland in 1911, he came to America as a child. By the 1940s, he was running a music shop at 130 Park Row in Manhattan with a partner named Barney Sagman. They called it Sagman and Dronge. Alfred wasn't just a shopkeeper, though. He was a guitarist himself. Classical training, jazz chops. He knew instruments from the inside out. And when he bought out his partner in 1947 and renamed the place Alfred Dronge Music, he started specializing in something interesting: used guitars. He'd buy them, fix them up, and resell them. It was like going to guitar school every single day. You learn what makes a great instrument when you're taking apart mediocre ones. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 1951, something happened that would change everything. The workers at Epiphone, one of the premier guitar makers in New York, went on strike. This wasn't just any strike. These were craftsmen fighting for better wages and working conditions. The company's response? They basically said, "Fine, we're out of here." They packed up and moved their operation to Philadelphia in 1953. Suddenly, New York City had dozens of highly skilled guitar makers with nowhere to work. Master craftsmen, guys who'd been building archtops for decades, just sitting there, unemployed. Think about what that meant. These weren't guitar factory workers in the modern sense. These were old-world craftsmen. Guys who could carve a neck by eye, set an intonation perfectly, apply a nitrocellulose finish that would age like fine wine. They knew secrets that had been passed down through generations, and they were all available. Alfred Dronge saw an opportunity, but he needed a partner who understood the business side. Enter George Mann, a former Epiphone executive. Mann knew the industry inside and out. He understood distribution, dealer networks, all the business stuff that Dronge didn't want to deal with. Together, on October 24th, 1952, they registered a new company. They called it Guild. The name was intentional. It evoked the old-world craft guilds, those medieval associations of master artisans. Quality, tradition, craftsmanship. That's what they were selling. They set up shop in a tiny 1,500 square foot loft at 536 Pearl Street in Manhattan, right in the heart of everything. Jazz clubs all around, recording studios, and most importantly, all those displaced Epiphone workers were right there, ready to be hired. The first foreman they brought on was Enrico Cappiello, a 25-year veteran from Epiphone. They started small, just a handful of employees, building guitars by hand, one at a time. But here's the thing about partnerships: they don't always last. After just 1 year, George Mann was out, left Alfred holding the bag. Most people would have folded right there. Instead, Dronge doubled down. He brought in 3 craftsmen who would become legendary in the guitar world. They called them the Three Amigos. There was Gilbert Diaz, originally from Puerto Rico, a veteran from Gretsch who handled final assembly. Carlo Greco, an Italian master luthier who'd come by way of Argentina. And Fred Augusto, a finishing specialist. These 3 guys stayed with Guild for over 25 years. They were the soul of the company. The first Guild guitars were hollow body electrics, big, beautiful jazz boxes, and Alfred knew how to market them. He wasn't just building guitars, he was building relationships. He got endorsements from the biggest names in jazz. Johnny Smith, who'd been voted top guitarist in the Downbeat Readers' Poll of 1954, George Barnes, Carl Kress, Barry Galbraith. These weren't just names on a poster. These guys actually played Guild guitars. Johnny Smith even worked directly with the factory to develop a signature model, the Artist Award. That guitar became legendary, but here's what really set Guild apart in those early years: the quality. Remember, these craftsmen had been building guitars for Epiphone and Gretsch. They knew every trick in the book. They understood wood selection, bracing patterns, neck angles, all those little details that separate a good guitar from a great one. And Alfred Dronge wasn't cutting corners to maximize profit. He was a player himself. If a guitar didn't sound right, it didn't leave the factory. Guild guitars from the 50s had this reputation for being incredibly well made. The fretwork was immaculate. The intonation was spot on. The finishes were gorgeous. They were competing directly with Gibson and Gretsch, companies that had been around for decades. But Guild was holding its own. By the end of 1956, they were producing between 100 and 120 guitars per month with just 15 employees. That's impressive craftsmanship at scale. By 1956, Guild was bursting at the seams. Too many orders, not enough space. They moved across the river to Hoboken, New Jersey, into this old building on Newark Street. That address would become iconic. To this day, when Guild reissues their classic electrics, they call it the Newark Street Collection. That's how important that place was. The Hoboken factory was on the second floor of an old building. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't climate controlled, but it had space and it had character. The craftsmen spread out. They set up specialized workstations. One area for rough shaping, another for finish work, another for assembly. The smell of wood shavings and lacquer became part of the neighborhood. If you walked past that building in the late 50s or early 60s, you'd hear the sound of sanding, sawing, and the occasional test strumming of a finished guitar. And the guitars that came out of Hoboken, they had a vibe. You can tell a Hoboken-era Guild just by looking at it. The craftsmanship is visible in every detail. The binding work is flawless. The sunburst finishes have this depth that you just don't see anymore. Collectors go crazy for Hoboken Guilds. A 1960s Starfire from Hoboken can go for serious money today, and it's not just collector hysteria. Those guitars genuinely sound and play differently. There's a magic to them. Through the late 50s and into the 60s, music was changing. Jazz was still huge, but folk music was exploding, and Guild was right there, ready for it. They started making acoustic guitars, dreadnoughts, the D40, the D50, the D55. These weren't copies of Martin guitars. They had their own voice. Deeper, richer, with this incredible low-end punch. And Guild did something in 1972 that changed acoustic guitars forever. They built the first production dreadnought with a cutaway, the D40C. Now, that might not sound revolutionary, but think about it. Acoustic players had always been stuck with the lower frets when they needed to reach the upper register. Guild's president Leon Tell and guitarist designer Rick Excelente came up with this cutaway design that gave you access to all of those high frets without sacrificing the dreadnought's big, bold sound. Every guitar company copies it now, every single one, but Guild did it first. The D40 itself became iconic. Introduced in 1963, it had a solid spruce top, mahogany back and sides, rosewood fretboard. That combination gave it warmth and clarity. Folk players loved it because it had enough volume to cut through a coffee house without an amp. Rock players loved it because it could take a beating and keep on singing. And the price point, it was positioned right where a working musician could actually afford one. But the electric side, that's where things got really interesting. In 1960, Guild launched the Starfire series. Now, if you know guitars, you know that Gibson had already introduced the ES-335 in 1958. That semi-hollow, double cutaway design was revolutionary. Guild saw what Gibson was doing and said, we can do that, but we can do it our way. The first Starfires had a single Florentine cutaway. The Starfire 1 had one pickup. The Starfire 2 had two. The Starfire 3 added a Bigsby tremolo. But here's what made them special. Guild finished them in cherry red. Bright, bold, beautiful cherry red. They called it Starfire Red. This was new for Guild. Before this, everything was sunburst or blonde, traditional, conservative. But the Starfire was aimed at a younger generation. The catalog literally said it was for the young artist with a flair for showmanship. Then, in 1963, they introduced the double cutaway versions, the Starfire 4, 5, and 6. These were the ones that really took off. Semi-hollow bodies with that classic double-cut shape, and the pickups. Early models had de-armand single coils, but they switched to humbuckers to keep up with the times. The Starfire 4 became especially beloved by blues players. Let's talk about what made these different models special. The Starfire 4 had 2 humbuckers, a center block to reduce feedback, and that beautiful bound body. It was the workhorse. The Starfire V, same basic guitar but with fancier appointments, block inlays instead of dots, gold hardware instead of chrome. The Starfire 6 was the top of the line, ebony fretboard, bound F-holes, and in 1966 they added the Starfire 12. A 12-string that could compete with anything Rickenbacker was making. But here's the cool part. You could get these guitars in colors that would make other companies blush. Sure, cherry red was the classic, but you could also order emerald green, which is now incredibly collectible, honey amber, ebony grain, even black. For an extra $20, you could get pretty much any color you wanted. Guild understood that rock and roll musicians wanted to stand out. They wanted to look good on stage. And a bright green Starfire 3, that'll turn heads. So who played these guitars? Oh man, where do we even start? Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead? He played a Starfire 3 early in his career. There are pictures of him with the Warlocks, before they became the Dead, playing that beautiful red Starfire. Buddy Guy? The blues legend became absolutely synonymous with the Starfire 4. Guild literally put him on posters and advertisements. That was his guitar. Tom Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival played a Starfire 3. Norah Jones, decades later, would fall in love with vintage Starfires and play them constantly. But the Starfire wasn't the only Guild electric making waves. Muddy Waters played a Guild Thunderbird, this wild semi-hollow with a sharp, biting tone. The Kinks' Dave Davies had a Starfire. Jefferson Airplane's Jack Casady played a Starfire bass, and he loved it so much that Guild eventually made a signature model for him. That bass became one of the most recorded instruments of the psychedelic era. You can hear it all over Electric Ladyland when Casady played with Jimi Hendrix. And it wasn't just rock and blues. Jazz players stayed loyal to Guild. The archtops that Alfred Dronge had built his reputation on were still being played in studios and clubs all over New York. These were serious instruments for serious players. The kind of guitar you'd see in a session with guys who could read anything put in front of them and nail it on the first take. Now we need to talk about something Guild did better than almost anyone else. 12-string guitars. In the mid-60s, 12 strings were everywhere. The Byrds were jangling their way up the charts. Folk rock was huge. And while Rickenbacker got a lot of the attention with their electric 12s, Guild was quietly building some of the best 12-string acoustics in the world. The Guild 12-string used a jumbo F-body, but here's the genius part. They put dual truss rods in the neck. 2 truss rods. Why? Because 12 strings put almost twice the tension on a neck compared to a 6-string. Other companies were building 12 strings that would develop neck problems after a few years. The necks would bow. The action would get too high. Guild said, not on our watch. Those dual truss rods meant a Guild 12 could handle the tension year after year without issues. And the tone? Oh man, the tone. Guild 12s had this deep, rich sound that was different from Martin's chimmier approach. Guild 12s were workhorses. You could beat on them. You could play them for hours. They wouldn't fall apart on you. John Lennon played a Guild Starfire 12. That's the guitar you hear on some of those mid-period Beatles recordings. Jimi Hendrix bought a left-handed Guild F212 string from Manny's Music in New York in 1970. These weren't second-choice instruments. These were what the best players wanted. But we need to talk about the acoustics. Because in 1969, something happened that would cement Guild's place in music history forever. Woodstock. The festival was a disaster logistically. Acts were delayed by traffic. The original opening band, Sweetwater, couldn't get there. Someone needed to go on stage and fill time. That someone was Richie Havens. And the guitar he grabbed? A Guild D40. Now, Richie Havens didn't play guitar like other people. He tuned to open D. He strummed with this incredibly aggressive percussive style. Some people said it looked like he was beating up his guitar. He played so hard that he'd actually worn grooves in the pickguard. He had to add an upper pickguard just to protect the soundboard from his relentless attack. That morning at Woodstock, Richie was supposed to play for maybe 45 minutes. He ended up playing for hours. Freedom. Handsome Johnny. Here comes the sun. That Guild D40, made in New York, just like the festival it was playing, rang out over Max Yasgur's farm. 400,000 people and one Guild guitar. When the Woodstock movie came out, that performance became iconic. And everybody wanted to know, what guitar is that? There's actually a great story about that guitar. Richie was so connected to Alfred Dronge and his son Mark that Guild became his guitar for life. He wasn't just endorsed by them. He genuinely believed in what they were building. That D40 he played at Woodstock, he beat it so hard that day that the guitar needed serious repairs afterward, but he kept playing Guilds. Years later, Guild even released a Richie Havens signature D40 model, complete with the double pickguard setup he'd created. It was a tribute to a man who'd shown the world what a Guild could do when pushed to its absolute limit. Meanwhile, back at Guild, things were growing. By 1966, they'd outgrown Hoboken. Alfred Dronge found an old furniture factory in Westerly, Rhode Island. It had space, it had machines. It even came with 25 experienced woodworkers who Guild rehired. The foremen from Hoboken all agreed to relocate. It was a big move, but it worked. Production ramped up, quality stayed high. Guild was flying. The Westerly factory was something else. It was massive compared to Hoboken. Real production capability. But Dronge didn't want to lose that craftsman approach. So he came up with a brilliant solution. He brought the new Rhode Island workers to Hoboken for a 6-week training program. The old Hoboken guys taught the new Westerly guys everything they knew. How to read the wood grain, how to apply finishes, how to set up a guitar so it played like butter. It was like a masterclass in guitar building. And it worked. The Westerly guitars maintained the quality that Guild had built its reputation on. Some people actually argue that the Westerly era produced the most consistent Guild guitars ever made. Every guitar that left that factory was set up properly. Every guitar was inspected. In 1969, Dronge hired Jim Durlew as plant manager. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Durlew later went on to help found Heritage Guitars. The guy knew quality control. Under his watch, Guild guitars became even more consistent. The Westerly factory could handle volume, but it never became a soulless production line. You could still walk through that factory and see craftsmen working, not just button pushers. Real guitar builders who cared about what they were making. That's rare in any industry, but especially in guitar manufacturing. And Alfred Dronge, he was literally flying. See, the offices stayed in New Jersey, but the factory was now in Rhode Island, over 200 miles. So Alfred, being Alfred, he learned to fly, bought himself a small plane, started commuting back and forth by air. It saved time, it was efficient, it worked perfectly until May 3rd, 1972. Alfred was flying from New Jersey to Rhode Island. Bad weather rolled in, the kind of weather where you should probably stay on the ground. But Alfred had a factory to run. He took off anyway. Somewhere between New Jersey and Rhode Island, in heavy weather, Alfred Dronge's plane went down. He was 60 years old. The founder of Guild Guitars, the guy who'd built the whole thing from nothing, was gone. The guitar world was shaken. Alfred wasn't just a businessman. He was a musician, a craftsman. Everybody who worked for him said the same thing. He cared about the guitars, about the people who made them, about the people who played them. His death left a hole that nobody could really fill. Stories about Alfred flooded in after his death. How he'd walk the factory floor and talk to every worker. How he'd pick up a guitar, play it, and immediately know if something was off. how he'd personally respond to letters from customers. He wasn't some distant CEO. He was hands-on. He was there. And suddenly, he wasn't. The company he left behind was successful. It was profitable. It had a great reputation, but it had lost its compass. Alfred had been the driving force for 20 years. He'd made every major decision. He'd set the tone. Without him, Guild was like a ship without a captain. It would keep sailing for a while on momentum, but eventually it would drift. Leon Tell, who'd been vice president since 1963, took over as president. He kept things going through the 70s and into the early 80s, but it wasn't the same. How could it be? Meanwhile, the guitar market was changing. The folk boom of the 60s was over. Rock was splintering into 1,000 different genres. Punk happened. New wave happened. Companies had to adapt or die. Guild adapted. They kept making their classic models, and the quality stayed high. A lot of guitar companies saw their standards slip in the 70s. Not Guild. Those Westerly guitars from the 70s are still considered some of the best instruments the company ever made. Consistent, reliable, beautiful. But they also had to innovate. In the 80s, they introduced solid body guitars with these wild pointed headstocks that people called pointy droopy or duckfoot or cake knife. Models like the Flyer, the Aviator, the Liberator, the Detonator. They were trying to compete with the Superstrats that were everywhere. Jackson, Charvel, Ibanez. Everybody was making guitars with Floyd Rose tremolos and humbucker single humbucker pickup configurations. Guild jumped in with both feet. Were these guitars as iconic as the Starfires or the D40? Probably not, but they were well made and they found their players. The T200 and T250, these Telecaster-style guitars, got endorsed by Roy Buchanan, one of the most underrated guitarists of all time. And when the grunge era hit in the 90s, Kim Thale of Soundgarden was playing a Guild S100, the solid body that became synonymous with the Seattle sound. You can hear it all over Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown. That guitar helped define an entire generation of rock music. Let's talk about some of the other models that don't get enough attention. The M75 Aristocrat, introduced in 1954, was Guild's answer to the Les Paul, single cutaway, mahogany body, twin humbuckers. It was later renamed the Bluesbird and went through various iterations. That guitar had a fat, warm tone that blues players loved. It wasn't as bright as a Les Paul. It had its own personality. Then there was the Thunderbird, which came in two versions. The S200, introduced in the early 60s, was this wild, offset, solid body. It looked like nothing else on the market. Sort of like if a Jazzmaster and a Maserite had a baby. Muddy Waters played one. Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys brought one back into the spotlight in the 2000s. When Guild reissued it in 2016, people went nuts. It turns out there was real demand for a guitar that looked that cool and sounded that good. And we can't forget about the Guild basses. The Starfire bass, played by Jack Casati and Phil Lesh, was a monster. Deep, round tone. Perfect for psychedelic rock. The Pilot bass in the 80s was ahead of its time, with both fretted and fretless options in 4 and 5 string configurations. Guild understood that bass players needed the same level of quality and innovation as guitar players. Through all of this, ownership kept changing hands. Avnet Corporation had bought Guild back in 1966, while Dronge was still alive. After his death, they held on to it for a while, but eventually sold it to a management group in 1986. That group held it for less than a decade. Then, in 1995, Fender bought Guild. Fender. One of the giants. You'd think that would have been great for Guild, right? More resources, bigger distribution, all that. But here's what happened. In 2001, Fender closed the Westerly factory, the one that had been making Guild guitars since the late 60s. They moved production to Corona, California, to their own facility. The Westerly workers actually prepared guitar kits to ship to Corona, so the California team could learn how to assemble them. It was the end of an era. Why did Fender close Westerly? They cited climate control issues and workflow problems. But a lot of people think it was really about consolidation. Fender wanted all their production under one roof where they could control it. The Westerly factory was old. It was quirky. It required specialized knowledge. It was easier to just bring everything to California. The guild community was devastated. Westerly, Rhode Island had been building guilds for over 30 years. The town identified with the brand. Workers had spent their entire careers there. And suddenly, it was over. The last guitars to roll out of that factory are incredibly collectible today. They represent the end of something special. Production bounced around after that. Corona, then Tacoma, Washington, then New Hartford, Connecticut. Guild stopped making electric guitars in America in 2004, moving that production overseas to Korea and Indonesia. For a company that had been built on New York craftsmanship, built by those old Epiphone workers in a Manhattan loft, it had to sting. But here's the interesting thing. The guilds made in Korea and Indonesia were actually pretty good. Fender didn't just farm out production to the lowest bidder. They found factories that could maintain quality standards. A 2000s era guild made in Korea might not have the mojo of a 1960s Hoboken guitar, but it was still a well-made instrument. It played well, it sounded good, and it was affordable. But the story doesn't end there. In 2014, Fender sold Guild to Cordoba Music Group. Suddenly, Guild had new life. Cordoba moved operations to Oxnard, California. They brought back classic models. The Newark Street Collection, named after that old Hoboken address, reissued those vintage electrics from the 50s and 60s. The Starfires came back. The Westerly Collection brought back acoustic guitars. They even opened a custom shop. And here's the thing. These weren't cheap knockoffs of the originals. Cordoba actually cared about getting it right. They studied the vintage guitars. They talked to collectors and players who'd been playing guilds for decades. The reissued Starfire 4 sounds like a 1960s Starfire 4. The attention to detail was there. The HB2 pickups they developed captured that classic guild tone. The age finishes looked authentic. These guitars had soul. The modern guild lineup also expanded into new territory. They introduced the Surfliner, this retro-inspired offset guitar that combined vintage aesthetics with modern playability. They kept making the M20, that compact acoustic that Nick Drake had made famous on the cover of Brighter Later back in 1971, and that Bob Marley used as his writing guitar. That same M20 is what indie artist Beabadoobie uses today. 3 generations of musicians, same guitar model, completely different music. That's the power of a good design. Then in 2023, the Yamaha Guitar Group acquired Cordoba, which means they acquired Guild too. So now Guild Guitars, the little company that started in a Manhattan loft in 1952, is part of one of the biggest music corporations in the world. It's a long way from Alfred Dronge fixing up used guitars in his shop, but those vintage Guilds, the ones from the Hoboken era, from the Westerly glory days, they're still out there, still being played, still sounding incredible. You can find a 1960s Starfire 4 and it'll blow your mind. A 1970s D40 will still have that deep, powerful voice. These guitars were built to last. And the new ones? Guild is still making guitars that punch way above their weight class. They're not trying to be Gibson. They're not trying to be Fender or Martin. They're being Guild. That's what Alfred Dronge wanted from the beginning. A guitar that stood on its own. A guitar with its own voice. Think about all the music that's been made on Guild guitars. Richie Havens opening Woodstock, Jerry Garcia in the early days of the Grateful Dead, Buddy Guy bending those strings on a Starfire 4, Kim Thayil creating the sound of grunge with his S100, Norah Jones bringing jazz back to the mainstream with her vintage Starfire 3, Bob Marley writing songs on his Guild at home in Jamaica. These aren't just guitars, they're part of music history. And that's the real story of Guild. It's not about being the biggest or the most famous. It's about making guitars that musicians actually want to play. Guitars with character, guitars with soul. From a tiny loft in Manhattan to Hoboken to Westerly to wherever they end up next, that core idea has never changed. So the next time you see a Guild guitar, whether it's a vintage one or a brand new reissue, remember, that's not just a guitar. That's a piece of American music history. That's the legacy of Alfred Dronge and those three amigos and all those craftsmen who poured their hearts into every instrument. That's the sound of jazz and folk and rock and blues and everything in between. If you enjoyed learning about Guild guitars, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're exploring the histories of all the great guitar brands, the stories behind the models you know and love, and the musicians who made them famous. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment about your favorite Guild guitar or guitarist, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep playing.